They laughed at my flood berm, so I scheduled it for demolition. 3 days later, a storm rolled through and turned their laughter into $2 million worth of water damage. That's not me trying to sound dramatic. That's just how it happened. My name's Daniel Harper. I'm 46, retired civil engineer, spent a little over 20 years working stormwater and infrastructure for a mid-sized county in eastern North Carolina. Drainage basins, culverts, retention ponds, FEMA maps, that kind of thing. I'm not flashy. I don't golf. I don't belong to a country club. I like diesel engines, black coffee, and knowing exactly where water is going to move before it gets there. About 8 years ago, I bought a small house on a stretch of riverfront land just outside town. Nothing fancy. Vinyl siding, metal roof, gravel drive that crunches loud enough to wake the dead. But it sits 12 feet higher than the subdivision downhill from me. That subdivision is called Rivers Bend Estates. Big brick colonials, 3-car garages, manicured lawns so green they look photoshopped. Every mailbox matches. Every holiday wreath is approved by committee. And yes, there's an HOA. Now, I don't live in the HOA. My property predates their development by decades. My place is upstream, technically outside their jurisdiction, but water doesn't care about jurisdiction, and neither do gravity or physics. The first time I met the HOA president, her name was Cheryl Whitman. She came up my driveway in a white Lexus and stepped out like she'd just walked off a real estate commercial. She had this tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Harper," she said, looking around at my gravel, my truck, my stack of lumber. "We're concerned about runoff from your property." I almost laughed right there. I'd been designing runoff mitigation systems longer than her subdivision had existed. But she wasn't entirely wrong. Every hurricane season, this region gets hammered. Slow-moving storms that sit on top of you and dump inches per hour. I'd watched it for years while working for the county. Before Rivers Bend was built, the land downhill from me was open pasture and woodland. Water spread out naturally, soaked in, drained slow. Then came grading, compacted soil, driveways, rooftops, patios, all that impervious surface. They changed the hydrology of the entire slope. Nobody upstream asked for that. Nobody downstream asked me. After the first big storm post-development, I noticed something interesting. Water was backing up along the edge of my lower yard where the natural swale used to carry flow downhill. Their drainage pipes weren't sized for the increased velocity from upstream concentration. The grading altered sheet flow patterns. The result was a bottleneck right at the top of their first row of homes. So I did what engineers do. I measured. I ran flow calculations. I modeled peak discharge using updated rainfall intensity curves. I confirmed what my gut already knew. If a major storm hit at the wrong angle, Rivers Bend would flood from the top down, not from the river. And that's when I built the berm. 4 feet high, reinforced concrete core, rebar grid tied every 16 inches, anchored below frost depth. On the outside, it looked simple, maybe even crude, but it was positioned precisely along a contour line to intercept and redirect a portion of upstream runoff into a reinforced drainage channel that fed into an older culvert system the county had installed years ago. That berm protected my house, yes, but it also slowed and redistributed roughly 40% of peak stormwater that would otherwise accelerate downhill straight into Rivers Bend's basements. I didn't build it for them, but it helped them. For 3 years, no issues. Then property values climbed. New board members took over the HOA. And suddenly, my berm became an eyesore. I received the notice on a Tuesday afternoon. Cream-colored cardstock, laminated, official seal stamped in blue ink. It cited visual blight, unapproved structure affecting community aesthetic, potential alteration of historical drainage patterns. $1,000 per week in fines until removal. I stood in my kitchen reading it twice, then 3 times, and I actually felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something closer to disbelief. They'd never once asked me what the structure did. They never requested my drainage study. They just voted. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended purely out of curiosity, Cheryl stood at the front of the clubhouse with a laser pointer like she was defending a thesis. "We cannot allow unregulated structures that divert water flow," she said. I raised my hand. "It doesn't divert in the way you're implying. It attenuates peak discharge. There's a difference." A few heads turned. One guy whispered something about overengineering. Cheryl smiled thinly. "Mr. Harper, with respect, Your wall may protect your property, but our independent review suggests it interferes with natural flow. Who did the review? I asked. She hesitated. A consultant. I knew what that meant. Somebody's brother-in-law with a landscaping license. I offered to share my full hydrology report. I even brought copies. They declined. The vote was 4-1 in favor of enforcement. Remove the berm or face escalating fines and legal action. As I walked back to my truck, I heard someone behind me say, his cheap wall won't save him anyway when a real storm hits. I didn't turn around. Back home, I pulled out my old field laptop and reopened the models. I updated rainfall projections using the most recent NOAA intensity data. I recalculated peak flow without the berm in place. 8,500 gallons per minute during a moderate hurricane event. Over 11,000 during a severe one. Straight downhill. I printed the report, all 67 pages of it. Attached a cover letter. Sent it certified mail to the HOA board with a liability disclaimer. Owner assumes no responsibility for downstream water damage resulting from removal of upstream attenuation structure at request of Rivers Bend Estates HOA. And at the bottom, one simple sentence. Demolition scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m., as requested. The next morning, Cheryl called. Her voice didn't have that polished Lexus shine anymore. Daniel, you're not seriously taking it down, are you? I looked out my window at the berm catching a light drizzle, doing its job quietly like it always had. You asked me to, I said. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, we think you're bluffing. I told her I don't bluff about water. And Thursday morning, a yellow excavator rolled up my gravel drive. Thursday morning came in gray and heavy, the kind of sky that feels like it's holding its breath. The excavator operator, a guy named Luis I'd worked with on county jobs years back, stepped out of his truck and looked at the berm, then at me. You sure about this, Dan? He asked quietly. Yep, I said, hands in my jacket pockets. They want it gone. He didn't ask more. Guys who work around dirt and steel learn when not to. By 9:15, the bucket bit into the first section. Concrete cracked with that deep, hollow thud that travels through your ribs. Rebar snapped and twisted like broken ribs sticking out of bone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was methodical. Each section came down in measured cuts, 60 feet total scheduled for removal to satisfy the HOA's complaint about visual obstruction. I stood there the entire time, not smiling, not angry, just watching something I designed and poured with my own hands get peeled back layer by layer. Around 10:30, a white Lexus crawled halfway up my drive, but didn't come all the way. Cheryl sat inside, engine running. I could see her through the windshield, phone pressed to her ear, watching. By noon, the protective contour was gone. What remained was a clean slope, unobstructed, smooth, natural-looking, exactly what they'd asked for. Luis shut down the machine. Storm coming, he said, glancing at the sky. I know. That afternoon, the forecast shifted. Tropical Storm Iris had been wobbling offshore for days, projected to scrape the Outer Banks and head north. But by 5 p.m., the cone tightened. New models showed a stall pattern over our county. Rainfall projections jumped from 4 inches to 8, then 9. I didn't need the Weather Channel to tell me what that meant. I pulled the updated radar loops and ran quick back of envelope numbers on flow concentration time. With the berm gone, peak discharge would hit Rivers Bend within 40 minutes of sustained heavy rainfall. I slept fine that night. That might sound cold, but understand this. I'd given them the data. I'd warned them in writing. At some point, adults are responsible for their votes. Friday started calm. Humid. Too quiet. Around noon, the first outer bands rolled in, thin sheets of rain that misted sideways. By 3, it turned steady. By 5, it was relentless. 6 p.m., the rain rate hit an inch per hour. I walked down to the lower edge of my yard with a flashlight as dusk settled in. Water was already moving faster across the slope. Without the berm to intercept and redirect, it gathered momentum, merging into defined channels that hadn't existed the week before. 7 p.m., 2 inches accumulated. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Daniel, this is Mark Feldman, the HOA vice president said, voice tight. We're seeing some pooling near Aldercourt. Is this normal? For this rainfall rate? I asked. It's just beginning. There was breathing on the other end. Then, Cheryl says you designed drainage systems. Is there anything we should be doing? Do you have temporary sandbags staged? I asked. Silence. Pumps. More silence. You voted to remove your mitigation structure, I said evenly. The flow path is what it is now. 8 p.m., rain intensified to nearly 2 inches per hour. I could hear it pounding my metal roof like gravel thrown by the sky. Downhill, porch lights flickered on one by one. Headlights cut through sheets of rain as neighbors moved cars to higher driveways. Water reached the first set of basement window wells around 8:30. I could see it from my upstairs window, a slow gathering shine under security lights. 9 p.m., the real surge hit. It wasn't a dramatic wall of water. That's not how it works. It was acceleration. Volume meeting slope with nothing to slow it down. The natural swale that once diffused flow was now a chute. 11,000 gallons per minute is hard to picture, but I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like every inch of lawn becoming a shallow river, like mulch beds liquefying, like patio furniture drifting inches at a time before someone grabs it too late. My phone started lighting up. First Cheryl. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Water is coming through the basement doors, she said, voice shaking. It's rising. How high? I asked. 6 inches, no more. Cut your power to the lower level, I said immediately. Shut off breakers. In the background, I could hear shouting. A child crying. Someone saying the sump pump wasn't keeping up. Another call came in. Then another. I let them go to voicemail. 10 p.m., 3 inches had fallen in less than 2 hours. The retention pond Rivers Bend relied on was already overtopped. Their storm drains, designed for a 10-year event, were choking under what was quickly becoming a 50-year rainfall. Around 11, I grabbed a rain jacket and walked halfway down the slope. Not into their property, just to the boundary line. Water was rushing past my boots in ankle-deep sheets, heading straight where my berm used to redirect it. And there, under porch lights and handheld flashlights, I saw homeowners standing in the rain, staring uphill at me. One of them, a tall guy named Brent who'd once joked about my doomsday bunker wall, shouted through the storm. Do something. I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat. This is something, I said quietly, though he probably couldn't hear me over the rain. Midnight. The first basement window failed. Water poured in with that ugly, heavy slosh you never forget. Within 30 minutes, several homes reported 2 feet of standing water downstairs. I went back inside, shut my door, and sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, listening. It's a strange thing, hearing a neighborhood panic in the dark. Car doors slamming, engines revving, people yelling measurements, 3 feet, 4 feet, the word mold already being thrown around. At 2 a.m., rainfall totals hit 9 inches in 6 hours. 17 basements flooded between 4 and 7 feet. 8 homes later documented foundation cracking from hydrostatic pressure against interior walls. Water had nowhere to dissipate gradually anymore. It hit fast, hit hard, and lingered. By dawn, the rain tapered to a steady drizzle. The neighborhood looked like it had been dunked in a lake. Lawns churned into mud. Debris scattered. Basement windows coated in brown streaks marking high water lines like grim little trophies. Around 6:30 a.m., I heard shouting from downhill. A crowd had gathered in Cheryl's driveway. I could make out fragments drifting up the slope. My kids were sleeping down there. The insurance won't cover flood. You said it was cosmetic. Voices overlapped, anger layered over fear. 2 men shoved each other. Someone called the sheriff. I didn't go down. Instead, I made coffee and opened my laptop. News alerts were already mentioning localized flash flooding in our county. Not catastrophic, not historic, just severe enough to cause damage in poorly mitigated areas. At 8:15, Cheryl called again. This time, she wasn't polished. She wasn't authoritative. She was crying. Total damage estimates are over 2 million, she said. Daniel, we didn't understand. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the stripped slope where the berm once stood. I tried to explain, I said. There was a long pause. What would it take to fix it? She asked finally. That was the moment everything shifted. Not the storm. Not the flooding. That question. Because now it wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about power. It was about consequence. I told her I'd run new numbers and call back. And as I closed my laptop, watching sunlight creep over soaked brick houses below, I realized this wasn't just a fight about concrete anymore. It was about control. And if you want to know what terms I set and why they signed them. When Cheryl asked what it would take to fix it, I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, I knew exactly what it would take, but because I needed them to sit in it for a minute. Needed them to feel the weight of water the way I had felt the weight of that laminated violation notice in my kitchen. That morning the air smelled like wet drywall and churned earth. If you've ever walked into a flooded basement after the water starts to recede, you know that smell. It's not just moisture. It's insulation, carpet backing, paint, old boxes, childhood photo albums. It's people's lives steeping. I drove down around 9. Not to gloat. Not to parade around. I went because, engineer or not, I'm still a neighbor. The first thing I saw was a line of soaked furniture stacked along the curb. Sectionals split open at the seams. Mattresses sagging like tired lungs. Cardboard boxes disintegrating in the sun. Brent, the guy who'd yelled at me during the storm, was standing barefoot in his driveway, staring at a contractor van pulling up. He looked 10 years older than he had 2 days before. He saw me, and for a second I thought he might come at me again. But instead, he just shook his head slowly. "This didn't happen before," he said. "It did," I replied gently. "Just slower. That's the part people miss. Water has memory. It follows the path of least resistance. But when you change the landscape, you change its story." Cheryl's house had 3 industrial fans already set up in the garage. Her mascara had given up the fight. She waved me inside without saying much. The lower level of her home looked like a construction zone. Sheetrock cut out 4 feet high. Studs exposed. Dehumidifiers humming. "Our insurance adjuster says it's classified as surface water intrusion," she said flatly. "Flood exclusion applies." "Did anyone here carry separate flood coverage?" I asked. She shook her head. "You're half a mile from the river," she said defensively, like she was still trying to argue with physics. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out a folder. Inside were updated flow models I'd run that morning. Revised attenuation requirements. Soil saturation factors based on current conditions. "If the berm had remained," I said calmly, "you likely would have experienced minor yard erosion. Maybe some window well seepage. What happened instead was concentrated, high-velocity discharge." Mark, the vice president, stepped in from the hallway. His voice was tight. "Are you saying this is our fault?" I met his eyes. "I'm saying you voted to remove a functioning mitigation structure after declining to review the supporting data." Silence settled heavy in that stripped-out basement. Cheryl sank onto the bottom step of her staircase. "What will it cost?" she asked again. Now we were talking in the right language. I laid it out clean. "To rebuild the berm, properly, at 6 feet instead of 4, with deeper footings and extended lateral spread to account for increased upstream runoff projections, including reinforced diversion channeling tied into county infrastructure, labor, materials, equipment, roughly $850,000. There was an audible inhale from Mark. $850,000, he repeated. "For shared protection," I said. "Divided across 34 homes. That's about $25,000 each. Less than what several of you are already looking at in basement remediation." Cheryl looked like she might faint. And, I continued, because this part mattered more than the money, permanent engineering oversight on any future grading or drainage modifications within the subdivision. No landscaping alterations that affect slope without professional review. Mark frowned. "You want veto power." "I want hydraulic integrity," I corrected. The meeting that followed wasn't pretty. By noon, word had spread. Homeowners packed into Cheryl's stripped living room, folding chairs set up between air movers and extension cords. Emotions were raw. Some blamed me. Some blamed the board. Some blamed the storm. An older couple named the Garcias stood up first. Their basement had held decades of family photos. "We voted with the board because we trusted you," Mrs. Garcia said to Cheryl, voice trembling. "We didn't know." That word again. "Didn't know?" Brent spoke next, arms crossed tight over his chest. "So we just pay him now," he said, nodding toward me. "After all this?" I didn't rise to it. I just answered. "You don't pay me. You fund infrastructure that protects your homes. The alternative is hoping the next storm is gentler." A younger woman in the back, still in mud-stained leggings, asked quietly, "If we don't rebuild it, will this happen again?" "Yes," I said, "and possibly worse." No drama. No threat. Just math. The board stepped into a side room to deliberate. Voices rose. Doors shut harder than necessary. It took 2 hours. When they came back out, Cheryl's face had shifted. The polished HOA president was gone. What stood there was a tired homeowner staring down a long payment plan. "We accept," she said. There were murmurs. Some angry, some resigned. But nobody proposed an alternative. The final agreement came in just under $900,000, including additional channel reinforcement and monitoring access. Structured over 15 years. Roughly $26,000 per household. Monthly assessments recalculated and legally binding. And yes, written into the covenant amendment was a clause granting me professional review authority over any drainage impacting change within Rivers Bend. Not because I wanted power, because I'd seen what happened without it. Construction began 10 days later. This time, when the excavator rolled up my driveway, no Lexus lingered at the bottom watching skeptically. Instead, a few neighbors stood quietly, coffee cups in hand, observing. The new berm rose higher. 6 feet. Thicker core. Extended length. It wasn't pretty in the way brick facades are pretty. It was functional. Solid. Quiet. During the pour, Brent walked up beside me. "Never thought I'd say this," he muttered, staring at the wet concrete settling into forms. "But I'm glad you're stubborn." I gave him a half smile. "Water doesn't negotiate," I said. It took 8 days to complete. 2 months later, another system rolled through. Not as severe as Iris, but steady and strong. For inches overnight. I stood at my upstairs window again, coffee in hand. Water gathered along the slope. Hit the berm. Spread. Slowed. Redirected. Downhill, lawns stayed lawns. Basement lights stayed on. No panic. No shouting. Just rain. The first monthly assessment check arrived 3 days early. Memo line read, "Upstream protection fee." That became the unofficial nickname for the berm. Kids riding bikes past it would joke about the big wall. Adults stopped calling it ugly. Some even asked if we could landscape around it. I allowed low-root native grasses. Nothing that would compromise structure. Here's the part that people argue about when I tell this story. Was I wrong to take it down? Some say I should have fought harder. Sued. Refused compliance. Protected them from themselves. Maybe. But here's what I learned after decades working public infrastructure. People don't value what they don't understand. And they don't understand what they've never had to pay for. I didn't flood their homes. The storm did. Gravity did. Physics did. I simply stepped aside when they insisted. Do I feel bad about the damage? Of course I do. I don't enjoy seeing families tear out drywall. I don't enjoy kids losing finished basements. But I also don't enjoy being dismissed by a committee that confuses aesthetics with engineering. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the only ones that stick. Now, every hurricane season, when forecasts start tightening and the air turns that familiar heavy gray, Rivers Bend doesn't debate drainage anymore. They call me. Not because I demanded authority, but because water earned it for me. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were in my position, would you have left the berm standing no matter what? Fought the fines? Gone to court? Or would you have done exactly what I did, handed them the data, stepped back, and let reality make the argument? Drop your take in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you land on it. Was this justice, stubborn pride, or something in between? And if you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought landscaping was more important than infrastructure, I want to hear that too. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about revenge. It was about water. And water always wins. They shut off my power in the middle of a Montana cold snap, wind howling at 20 below, and they thought I'd just pack up and disappear. That was their first mistake. My name's Cole Mercer. I'm 36, licensed electrician, third generation on a patch of land my grandfather bought back in 1959, 43 acres of scrub pine and frozen dirt just outside Bozeman. I don't live in some glass palace with heated marble floors. I park my fifth wheel on my own property while I finish building my house the slow way. Cash, wiring it myself, No debt, no bank breathing down my neck. Simple. My neighbors? Different story. They live in those modern ranch-style luxury estates with black trim, heated driveways, and garages bigger than my entire trailer. Every winter, their windows glow like magazine covers. And every winter, someone from the Homeowners Association finds a reason to remind me I don't quite fit the brochure. The HOA president, Diane Whitaker, late 50s, perfect hair, drives a pearl white Range Rover. She smiles like she's offering you lemonade while she's measuring your property for violations. Her favorite phrase? Community harmony. January 14th. Wind chill at -18. I wake up because the heater stopped humming. You don't slowly wake up when that happens. You snap awake. It's the kind of cold that doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door in. Inside my trailer, it's 42 degrees and dropping. I throw on boots, step outside, breath turning into smoke, and that's when I see it. My electric meter pulled, tagged, and locked. Big red notice zip-tied to the conduit. Violation of winter aesthetic compliance. Fine, $900. Remove non-conforming dwelling within 14 days. Winter aesthetic compliance. In a blizzard. I call the number. Diane answers on the second ring, calm, composed, like we're discussing garden mulch. Cole, she says, we've received multiple complaints. The trailer disrupts the seasonal uniformity of the neighborhood. Seasonal uniformity. My pipes burst that morning. Cost me $2,400 in damage before noon. Water creeping under cabinets while I'm hauling space heaters from the hardware store just to keep the place above freezing. And here's the thing. This land predates their gated entrance, their stone monument sign, their architectural review committee. My grandfather grazed cattle here when their lots were sagebrush. But the HOA expanded boundary influence a few years back, annexed adjacent parcels through some legal gymnastics, and suddenly I'm under community oversight. That's what they called it. I called it harassment. Now here's where it gets interesting. 2 days later, I'm digging through old property records in my shop, mostly out of spite, and I find a yellowed folder labeled Utility Easement, 1962. Inside, there's a survey map and a handwritten note from my grandfather. Back in the early 60s, before the city extended gas lines out this far, he paid to have a private natural gas pipeline installed from the main junction 2 miles east. 2.7 miles of buried steel line running straight through what is now that entire subdivision. It branches, 47 connections total, 47 houses. Every single furnace in that pristine little community runs on a line installed and owned by my family. There was never a formal transfer. No sale. No recorded utility dedication. Just a handshake agreement and a scribbled note that reads, for neighbors, no charge, no contract, no conveyance, no utility company takeover, just goodwill. I call an attorney buddy of mine, not some billboard guy, an old classmate who actually reads statutes for fun. He digs in, checks county filings, pulls historical easement records. 3 days later, he calls me back. Cole, you're not going to believe this. The pipeline is still deeded under your parcel. There's no municipal adoption. There's no HOA utility agreement. Legally, it's yours, including the master shutoff valve. Where's the valve? I ask. In a concrete vault on your property, near the old well cap. I didn't sleep much that night, because suddenly this wasn't about a trailer anymore. It wasn't about $900 fines or seasonal uniformity. It was leverage. The next morning, I walked out to that concrete vault, brushed snow off the lid, pried it open, and there it was, a rusted but solid industrial gas valve, feeding warmth to every one of those luxury homes. I stood there a long time. I'm not a villain. I don't enjoy watching families suffer, but I also don't enjoy being treated like I'm disposable on land my grandfather cleared by hand. So I did what any electrician with documentation and a chip on his shoulder might do. I turned the valve 90 degrees. Slow, deliberate. Then I closed the lid. Within 30 minutes, my phone lit up like Christmas. Text from a neighbor, gas pressure issue. Another, is your line acting weird? Then Diane. Her voice was tighter now. Cole, we're experiencing a service interruption. Interesting, I said. According to my records, that's a private line. Silence. I spent the afternoon drafting certified letters, 47 of them. Simple terms. Gas service would resume upon execution of a formal utility lease. $380 per month per household, October through March. 15-year term. Reimbursement for $2,400 in damages caused by wrongful power termination. Immediate removal of all RV restrictions and fines. HOA acknowledgement of my land use autonomy. No signature, no heat. Was it aggressive? Sure. But so is shutting off someone's electricity in sub-zero weather over curb appeal. By nightfall, the temperature dropped to -10. Social media in the neighborhood group exploded. People scrambling for propane heaters, booking hotel rooms, dragging kids into SUVs to stay warm. Diane called again around 9 p.m. "This is reckless," she snapped. "No," I said calmly, staring at the thermostat in my trailer climbing back towards 70 because I'd hooked into my backup generator. Reckless was cutting power in a winter storm. She threatened legal action. I invited it. Because this time, I had paperwork older than her Range Rover. And that's when things really started to unravel. All right, let's pause the drama for a second, because this is where people usually get it twisted. According to standard procedure, an HOA can absolutely enforce aesthetic rules, paint colors, fencing, even what qualifies as a temporary dwelling. That part, pretty normal. When you buy into an HOA, you're agreeing to a private contract. It's not government law, it's civil agreement. Big difference. But here's the catch. HOAs only have authority over what's actually within their recorded covenants and legal control. They cannot seize utilities they don't own. They cannot terminate essential services without due process. And they definitely can't enforce rules outside properly annexed or contracted boundaries without airtight documentation. From a legal perspective, what mattered wasn't emotion, it was paper. Ownership. Recorded easements. Chain of title. If infrastructure was never formally transferred, then goodwill doesn't magically become community property. Now psychologically, this is a classic power hierarchy play. This is a psychological trap. When a board gets used to small wins, small compliance, small fines, they start believing authority equals ownership. They escalate because nobody pushes back. Until someone does. And when leverage flips, panic sets in fast. All right, back to the fallout. By sunrise the next morning it was -12, the kind of cold that makes the air feel brittle, like if you snapped your fingers it might shatter. My phone hadn't stopped vibrating since midnight. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Half the neighborhood suddenly discovering my contact info after 3 years of pretending I didn't exist. I made coffee slow, deliberate, let it drip. Because here's the thing about leverage. Once you use it, you don't rush. Around 8 a.m., the first real crack showed. A guy named Trevor, software engineer, always jogs with noise-canceling headphones, never waves, knocks on my trailer door. He's wearing a parka over pajama pants, breath fogging hard. "Hey man, this gas thing," he says, trying to sound casual. "My kids were up all night. Do you know what's going on?" I let the silence hang just long enough. "Yeah," I said. "Private infrastructure dispute." His face shifted, confusion turning into calculation. "You serious?" "Dead serious." By noon, 3 families had checked into hotels. I saw taillights rolling out of driveways like a slow evacuation. Portable heaters sold out at the hardware store. Someone posted in the HOA group asking if we could temporarily override Cole's valve. Override. Like I was a software glitch. Around 2 p.m., a fire truck rolled into the subdivision. Sirens off, lights just idling. Turns out an elderly couple, the Barrows, tried running a propane heater in their living room with the windows closed. Carbon monoxide alarm went off. Fire department did a welfare check. And here's where Diane's authority started crumbling. The fire captain asked who maintained the gas infrastructure. She said, confidently, the community. He asked for utility permits. She didn't have any. He asked who owned the line. Silence. Because you can't bluff paperwork when someone with a badge is holding a clipboard. By late afternoon, the HOA emergency meeting was packed. Folding chairs, red faces, raised voices echoing off drywall that wasn't heated anymore. I didn't attend. Didn't need to. A neighbor live-streamed part of it. It was chaos. "You told us utilities were secured. How are we not covered by insurance? Why are we paying dues if we don't even own the gas line?" One board member resigned on the spot. Then another. Diane tried to regain control, kept repeating the phrase, temporary service disruption, like saying it enough would make it true. But here's the reality. Once fear hits family homes, politics disappear. Night fell again, and the forecast dropped lower. -14 by midnight. At 7:30 p.m., Diane called. No greeting this time. What are your terms? She asked. Not angry. Not polished. Just tight. Same ones in the letters, I said. Plus one amendment. Silence. You step down as president, and the bylaws get rewritten to clarify infrastructure ownership. That's extortion. No, I said, steady. It's formalization. She exhaled hard. You're punishing families. I looked around my trailer, at the warped cabinet from the burst pipe, at the invoice sitting on the table. They punished me first. There was a long pause. I could almost hear the calculation happening on her end. Liability exposure, potential lawsuits, the optics if this dragged into a third night. You'll destroy the community, she said quietly. And that's when I realized something. The community wasn't what she was protecting. Control was. By 9 p.m., the revised contract draft went out electronically. I'd had my attorney tighten it up, clear lease language, indemnification clauses, maintenance cost sharing moving forward, annual inspection rights. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was structure. 47 households. Each one had to sign individually. Deadline, 11:59 p.m. Outside, the temperature hit -15. Inside my trailer, my generator hummed steady. 71 degrees. Stable. At 10:12 p.m., the first signed contract hit my inbox. Then another. Then 3 more in a batch. You could almost feel the momentum shift, pride dissolving into practicality. Trevor texted, signed. Please confirm. Confirmed. At 10:47 p.m., Diane emailed hers. No apology. Just a scanned signature and a short line. For the safety of residents. I didn't respond right away. Let it sit for 5 minutes. Because sometimes closure needs weight. At 11:38 p.m., the final household signed. 47 contracts. Certified electronic transfers for my $2,400 reimbursement already pending. Lease payments scheduled monthly through March. Formal acknowledgement that my RV was permitted indefinitely during primary construction. 11:52 p.m. I pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out into the snow. The subdivision was dark in that eerie way heated neighborhoods aren't used to. No furnace exhaust plumes rising, no low hum under the silence. Just wind scraping across rooftops. I reached the concrete vault. Snow had drifted over it again, like the earth trying to hide the lever that mattered most. I brushed it off, lifted the lid. The valve sat there cold and patient. And I'll be honest, I hesitated. Because power like that changes something in you. It's easy to become the villain in your own story if you're not careful. But this wasn't about domination. It was about correction. So I turned the valve back. Slow. Metal groaned softly under pressure shift. And then I waited. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a distant ignition. One furnace kicking on. Then another. Then another. A chain reaction across frozen lawns. 47 homes pulling heat at once. Within minutes, exhaust plumes rose into the night sky like white flags. I stood there in the cold and watched. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just steady. My phone buzzed. Trevor, heat's back. Thank you. Another message. We're warming up. Then one from Diane. Service restored. Board transition effective immediately. No emoji. No flourish. Just finality. I closed the vault and walked back to my trailer. Inside, I shut off the generator and flipped my own breaker panel back to grid power. Legally restored now that the HOA had reversed their enforcement notice as part of the signed agreement. Funny how fast violations disappear when liability enters the chat. I poured another cup of coffee, even though it was almost midnight. Outside, -15. Inside, 72. And for the first time since that red tag went up on my meter, the air felt even. Not because I won, but because balance had been restored. The next morning, the neighborhood looked different. Quieter. No one staring. No one measuring curb appeal. A few subtle nods as I drove past. Respect doesn't always come from popularity. Sometimes it comes from documentation. Diane moved out 6 months later. House sold quietly. New board formed with actual legal counsel involved this time. And every winter since, the gas flows under a signed agreement. Inspected, insured, transparent. No more handshake assumptions. No more aesthetic power plays. Just terms. And heat. So what's the lesson here? Because if this was just a revenge story, it'd be shallow. Entertaining, sure, but shallow. The lesson here is leverage without structure eventually turns into abuse, on both sides. Look, HOAs aren't evil by default. They exist because people want predictability, clean streets, protected property values, uniform standards. And honestly, that's fair. When you buy into one, you're signing up for shared rules. But here's where it goes sideways. When small authority goes unchecked long enough, it stops being about order and starts being about identity. Board members stop seeing themselves as volunteers and start seeing themselves as gatekeepers. Every compliance win reinforces the belief that control equals competence. This is a psychological trap. The more someone gets used to people saying, okay, the more shocking it becomes when someone says no. And when that no comes with paperwork, that's when panic replaces confidence. From a legal perspective, the real turning point wasn't when I shut off the valve. It was when documentation entered the conversation. Recorded easements, chain of title, transfer history. Most conflicts like this don't explode because someone's malicious. They explode because assumptions go unchallenged for decades. My grandfather meant well. For neighbors, no charge. That was generosity. But generosity without structure creates dependency. And dependency without clarity creates entitlement. And entitlement? That's gasoline on any small spark of resentment. I could have kept that valve off longer. I could have pushed harder, raised the price, forced more concessions. That's the dark side of leverage. Once you realize you have it, it's tempting to test how far it stretches. But power is a mirror. The second you enjoy someone else's discomfort, you become the thing you were fighting. What changed the outcome wasn't punishment. It was formalization. We moved from handshake to contract, from assumption to clarity, from aesthetic opinions to recorded rights. And something else happened too. The neighborhood shifted. Not dramatically, not like we all started having barbecues together, but the tension eased. Because once rules are written and ownership is defined, everyone can breathe, even the people who don't like each other. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Part of Diane's reaction? Fear. If she admitted the infrastructure wasn't HOA owned, that meant the board had been operating under a flawed assumption for years. That threatens reputation, authority, ego. When identity is tied to leadership, admitting error feels like self-destruction. So she doubled down. Most escalation isn't about money. It's about pride. If you're in an HOA or thinking about buying into one, here's my advice as a guy who learned it the hard way. Read everything, not just the glossy summary. Dig into recorded documents. Understand what's actually owned versus what's assumed. Know where infrastructure starts and stops. Ask boring questions. Boring questions prevent dramatic winters. And if you're ever on a board, remember you're a steward, not a ruler. Authority in a community is rented, not owned. The second it becomes personal, you've already lost perspective. Would I handle it the same way again? Honestly, I'd still turn the valve, but I'd probably call for a meeting before it hit -15. Because the goal isn't to freeze people out. It's to stop being treated like you don't belong on land your family bled for. Outside my trailer that night, it was cold enough to crack stone. Inside, it was steady. And that's really what this whole thing was about. Stability, clarity, boundaries. So now I'm curious. What would you have done? If someone weaponized rules against you, would you fight back the same way? Would you negotiate first? Or would you let it slide for the sake of peace? And if you're on the other side of that fence, sitting on a board somewhere, how do you make sure authority doesn't quietly turn into overreach? Drop your thoughts below. I read more of them than you think. Because at the end of the day, communities don't fail because of cold weather. They fail because nobody checks the valve until it's too late.